So, welcome to the Unmixer, the making of. In the design process for designing this Unmixer, I had to come up with a device that would fit inside one of these beakers that would mix up some colours of food dye in glycerol, then unmix them again. So I started off by looking online at some various designs that already existed, and I discovered some of the limitations to some of those devices. They had to fit inside the cylinder, they had to smoothly move the liquid around without wobbling too much, and they had to be able to get in and out of the beaker to start off with. So my first design I created using SketchUp, which was a 3D modelling program I'd never used before, and then went into the 3D printer makerspace at ANU, and had a go at printing my first design out on one of the 3D printers, and this was my first design here. So to start off with, my design had a flat base that would fit inside the beaker to hold it steady and upright. The glycerol would fit in the narrow space between this and the glass beaker, and then I would twist it around using the handle. It was hollow on the inside because I had read online that they had a tendency to float upwards when they were hollow, so you could pour water in to hold it at the bottom of the beaker. Now, there were a few problems with this design. First of all, the handle wasn't sturdy at all. I'd connected it, this is two pieces and it's connected via a little hexagonal piece there. And this narrow piece was so wobbly that as soon as I tried to turn it, the torque was too much and too unbalanced, and it actually ended up just breaking off. Didn't break off straight away, but it did eventually. So that wasn't a good way of designing a handle. So you can see how it's broken off in there. Secondly, the grading around the edges was too rough, and I had read that you want a really smooth grading so that the friction force doesn't become too uneven, because we don't want any of that wobbling as we're mixing the liquids around. And the reason for that was a mistake I'd made on SketchUp. I had set the number of edges around the circle to be too low. Also, it didn't fit in the beaker. That was really the biggest problem, and you might be able to see, but on the edge I've actually sanded it down. I sanded it with sandpaper, but then I figured after this came off, I may as well design a new one, and that's what I did. My second design looks even simpler than the first, and this is it here. So a couple of changes that I made with this one was I completely eliminated this funky little handle, and the entire centre is one solid piece. It's again got the flat base to hold it down the bottom of the beaker, and this handle has two sides to it so that the torque in both directions is balanced. Again, it has a little hexagonal bit so that the handle got stuck on. I also made it nice and smooth by reducing the edges on SketchUp around the circle, and I reduced the diameter of the base so that hopefully it would fit in the beaker, but it still didn't. So I did have to sand it down just a little bit this time, and it fit right in. It's still not the perfect design though, and there were a couple of quite interesting flaws. The first of all was that when I was sanding this down to size, I was taking the sandpaper around the edges, trying to fit it in. I'd go around the edges again, try and fit it in the beaker. And the moment that I got it to fit in, I was surprised to realise that down the bottom of the beaker, it was still loose. It wobbles around a little bit. And that's when I realised that these beakers are an interesting shape. They are slightly bigger down the bottom in diameter than they are at the top, which means that even though my Unmixer only just fits in up the top, it's slightly loose down the bottom. This created some problems because the basis of my Unmixer was that this staying flat and steady on the bottom would reduce any wobbling to the side. So when this is slightly loose, I created that wobbling. The problem with the wobbling, you don't want your Unmixer wobbling on the inside of your beaker, is because in order to get that nice smooth laminar flow, that you get the different layers of the liquid moving parallel to one another, you can't have the beaker wobbling the Unmixer wobbling as you do so, because when you go back in the opposite direction you would have to replicate those wobbles exactly so that those parallel layers aren't mixing it all perpendicular. So that little bit of wobbling that I had was enough to smudge and smear the dots of food colouring in my final results, so they weren't perfect, and I think that's the biggest reason as to why. But it did still work quite well. I managed to get the colours, the food dye unmixing, which was fantastic, very exciting, and I experimented with honey and cornstarch as well as the glycerol, and I also tried with water and a combination of water and the glycerol. And I discovered, as I have summarised in the video, that the more viscous liquids unmixed a lot better. Another problem with the device, so first with the stabilisation problem, the wobbling, another way that I could fix that, which I would do if I were to improve on this design, was that I would put another circle or arms coming out the top to stabilise it at the top as well as the bottom. So that would, the one stabilisation down the bottom wasn't enough to hold it in place. If I had a second set of arms coming out here, that would hold it nice and steady. The other problem was that I was getting air bubbles trapped underneath here, and the air bubbles were sometimes escaping halfway through the unmixing process, and that would disrupt the drops of food colouring that had been smeared out, and that would stop them coming back to one nice dot in the end. In some instances this was also floating up, especially for the water and glycerin mix. It was actually floating up to the top of the beaker. So if I were to do this again, I wouldn't use a completely solid base, I would use arms coming out. And I think that would greatly minimise the wobbling, which was the biggest issue with this design. But overall, it worked pretty well. It worked pretty well, and I was very happy with my results, very excited to be using the 3D printers for the first time, and I thought it was super cool to see something that I designed, printed, and that I could hold in my hand to do some pretty nifty experiments with. Overall, pretty happy with my results, and this was a super fun experience. Cheers!